Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Ann Lounsbury, Chair of the Department of Russian Slavic Studies here. And I'm going to introduce two people who don't really need introduction, but I will do it nonetheless. I'm happy to. First, we have Evgenia Vats, our research professor here in the Department of Russian Slavic Studies at NYU. She's an investigative journalist, political scientist, author, and radio host. And since receiving her PhD in political science from Harvard, she has split her time between academia and journalism. Dr. Vats was previously distinguished journalist in residence here at the Jordan Center, 2022-2023. She's also been a media and democracy fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and a fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. She's the author of 4 independently researched books, including The State Within a State, KGB and His Hold on Russia, Past, Present, and Future. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Alexey Yurchak, who's professor of anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, where he's also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. Born and raised in Soviet Leningrad, he trained as a physicist before moving to the US and earning his PhD in cultural anthropology at Duke University. Yurchak is the author of the award-winning and I would say field-defining book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, The Last Soviet Generation. It was published by Princeton in 2005 and recently reissued with a new preface. He has also published widely on topics ranging from visual anthropology and experimental artistic scenes to the anthropology of space, political institutions, and ideologies in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. Professor Yurchak's talk today is entitled Sovereign Sacrifice, the War in Ukraine and the Remaking of Russia. Please join us in welcoming him to Jordan Center.
Anne, thank you very much for your lovely introduction. This amazing lecture by Professor Alexey Yurchak, Sovereign Sacrifice, the War in Ukraine and Russia's restructuring, concludes a series of seminars united under the common theme, quote, Russia and its neighbors in search of a new paradigm, end of quote. Throughout fall and spring semester, we held 11 events. The seminar featured 5 scholars, 2 journalists, 2 political experts, 1 businessman, and a special event dedicated to Alexei Navalny. The topics were wide-ranging, from Russia's economy and how much longer it can sustain its aggressive war against Ukraine, to analysis of the situation on the front lines of this war, now in its 5th year, US policy towards Russia, the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko and why he of interest to the US administration, mass culture, business from startup to prison, the internet's influence on political behavior, and so on. Every event was a sellout. Thousands of people watched the recordings of the Jordan Center's YouTube channel, and many thousands more Russian-speaking viewers from Russia, from inside Russia and in the diaspora and exile, watched these events on the New Times YouTube channel with Russian subtitles, and they also read the Russian language transcript of these events, edited for length and clarity on the website newtimes.ru. For me, it's extremely important. I do believe that for Russians who are now, basically lack of any access to information and to first-rate analysis, it is extremely important that they can listen and can read the analysis done by the first-rate American academics and experts. Next year, if all goes well, the seminar will continue, I hope, on the same day and at the same time. I think it would be interesting to shift the conversation a bit toward future, but I would appreciate any advice, ideas, and suggestions. I would like to thank Professor Josh Tucker, Director of the Jordan Center. Josh, thank you. Professor Ann Lounsbury, Chair of the Department of Russian Slavic Studies, and thank you. Elliot Borenstein, a professor in the department and NYU's Vice Provost for Global Affairs. Elliot, thank you so much. Without you, I wasn't here. And I also would like to thank President Linda Mills, who personally welcomed me when I transferred from Harvard to New York University for the opportunity to lead this seminar. I thank our grant provider, without whom this entire endeavor wouldn't have been possible at the first place, though he doesn't wish to have his name disclosed. Throughout this year, the seminar was organized by Alexandra Spitalnik, program director at the Jordan Center. Sasha, thank you. She's moving to the University of California, Berkeley, believe it or not, as a graduate student in political science, and this is her last in-person event.
Oh.
It's just a grief on mine. Yes. John Lin, administrator of the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies. Kirill Guskov, who is the producer of the entire series. He was responsible for creating all posters and subtitles and time codes and promotion via social media and social networks. And Anne Mentar, where Anne?
She's downstairs.
And Daniela Aris were indispensable assistants, thanks to whom our seminar went off without a hitch. I would like to conclude on a personal note. My grandson, Lincoln Alexei, who just turned 23 months old, and he has surprised me more than anything and anyone else. I'm just astonished. He's starting to talk, and he says, ka, little. How on earth does he know about the article and when to use and when to use the? Before now. I just cannot believe it. He says, car. Barbie, car. It's amazing. This is a real miracle. Professor Yuri. This I need to do a long introduction.
Stop that.
The sovereign sacrifice, the war in Ukraine, and the destruction of Russia. We're all, yes, listening to you. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation, for the wonderful warm introductions. And I'm very pleased to learn about the series. Can you hear me?
No, could you speak up a little?
I can speak up a little, but I have a microphone, it doesn't go into here.
No, there's no amplification in
Oh,
there.
it's simply for a
Yeah, yeah.
So can you hear me in the back if I speak like this?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's speaking much louder, it's hard for me. All right. So, sacrificial sovereignty, war in Ukraine and the remaking of Russia. The war in Ukraine has generated extensive analysis focused on Putin's geopolitical strategy, post-Soviet resentment, imperial ambition, and the pursuit of a multipolar world. Just one last pause, you can hear, right? Okay. These perspectives are important, but incomplete. They leave unexamined what the war does within Russia itself. The war is a devastating invasion of Ukraine, but it is also an instrument to transform Russian society. When the rapid change of Ukraine's political regime failed, and Ukrainians rejected the claim that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, the war was reframed, first as an existential struggle for Russia's survival, and later as a project for rediscovering Russia as a civilization. Unclear goals. The striking feature of Russia's invasion is that its goals remain unclear. When Putin launched the invasion in February 2022, he called it a special military operation, emphasizing limited scope and announcing two goals: protecting the people of Donbass and denazifying Ukraine. Denazification was an unfamiliar term, and Foreign Minister Lavrov explained it as removing the anti-people Nazi regime in Kiev so that Ukrainians could determine their own future. Putin then recast the goal again. NATO military infrastructure is moving closer to Russian borders, leaving me no choice but to act. But when Finland and Sweden joined NATO as a direct consequence of the invasion, Putin dismissed it as irrelevant. We have nothing that should concern us with regard to Finland and Sweden. If they want to join, let them. The justification shifted again as claims emerged about Ukrainian alleged biolaboratories near Russian borders, which were developing supposedly weapons targeting Russians, again leaving Putin no choice but preemptive action. in his own words. In October 2022, at the Valdai Discussions Club, the moderator asked Putin directly, "You and Russian officials have repeatedly said that the special military operation is going according to plan. But to be honest, the public doesn't understand what the plan is. Can you clarify it?" Putin responded not by clarifying, but by reframing again. "When our troops advanced from the south and from the north in eastern Ukraine, it became clear that the people living in these historic territories of Novorossiya see their future together with Russia. How could we not respond to that?" The claim was false, but it revealed something more important, a retroactive logic. This goal of the war emerged only after Russian troops occupied Ukrainian territory and encountered locals. Consequences were recast as causes. In December 2023, viewers of A Year in Review with President Putin asked two questions. What are the goals of the special military operation, and have they changed? In his response, Putin returned to a long-forgotten denazification, but made no mention of NATO, biolaboratories, or Novorossiya. A year later, in the same TV program, he named different objectives of the operation for that year: to liberate the Kursk Oblast and to achieve success along the front lines. Both were consequences of the war, not its causes. The pattern is clear. The invasion is not grounded in a consistent threat. Its objectives frequently shift, and consequences are recast as causes. This circularity is not confusion. It is designed to render the question of goals irrelevant. The meaning of the war is not its goals, but the sheer fact of its persistence as something given and unavoidable. A war perceived in this way doesn't invite judgment. It invites endurance. At the Valdai Forum that year, Putin provided another explanation. Despite occupying Ukrainian territory, he insisted, this is not a territorial conflict. Russia is the largest country in the world by territory, and we have no interest in conquering additional territories. The conflict is civilizational. The claim that Russia is a unique civilization has deep roots, of course, but the war has made it the regime's central ideological pillar. By spring 2023, Russia's new foreign policy concept officially described the country as a unique civilizational state. As Putin explained, only a handful of civilizations qualify as civilizational states, each following its own radically unique path of development. A Kremlin-sponsored journal, Russia and Global Politics, wrote, quote, "If earlier the priority for Russia was to become a member of the civilized quote-unquote world, that is Western-style liberal democracy, now Russia has accepted its status as a civilizational state and seeks to emphasize its own unique identity. For a long time, Russia has lived like a genie locked in a bottle corked with the stop of its Western fixation. But now Russian civilization has broken free, and its European journey that lasted for 3 centuries is finally over," unquote. Putin argues that the Russian civilizational state is an organic body that developed in a millennium-long evolutionary process. This organic body, unlike nation states, cannot be defined by borders. In the civilizational sense, he says, Russia has no borders. This body is governed by internal civilizational code or civilizational DNA. These quasi-biological terms are not just metaphorical. Civilizational state in this rhetoric is treated like distinct biological species. So different civilizational states can interact but cannot mix, just like animals in the animal kingdom. Imposing the value of one civilizational state onto another risks civilizational death. As Putin puts it, preserving the planet's civilizational diversity is as important as preserving its biodiversity. This doctrine is institutionalized through the state program DNA of Russia. On the right slide here, the logo plays on both the double helix of DNA and the double-headed eagle of the Russian state coat of arms. In 2023, it introduced mandatory training seminars for teachers and mandatory university courses, such as the Civilizational Code of Russian History at the Moscow State University here. The academic director of this program, Andrei Polosin, identifies 2 core elements of Russia's civilizational code: sacrificial disposition, жертвенность, and devotional service to the fatherland, служение Отечеству, Alexander Kharichev, head of the Presidential Office for Monitoring Social Processes, goes further. In a 2025 article, Who Are We?, he argues that sacrificial disposition takes precedence over all other values, including individual life. To members of Russian civilization, he writes, life is worth much less than to Westerners, because they believe there are things more important than the mere fact of living. This emphasis on sacrifice is framed not in religious terms, but in quasi-biological ones. Individual life is subordinate to the civilizational body, like a biological cell to an organism. Vladimir Solovyov, a leading state propagandist whose programs reach millions every day, captured this in a 2023 broadcast. Life is highly overrated. Why fear what is inevitable? In itself, life has no value. It is only worth living for something you can die for. This sacrificial logic was laid bare in Putin's meeting with mothers of soldiers killed at the front. Responding to one of them, so this is the meeting, responding to them, one of them, Putin said, and I'm going to project the quote. Of course, I will read it with you. Of course, this is a tremendous tragedy, but you know what comes to my mind? Around 30,000 people die in traffic accidents every year, and about the same number die from alcohol. It happens, unfortunately. We are all mortal, we are all under the Lord, and one day we will all leave this world. That's inevitable. The question is how one lived, how we have lived. Some people, you know, it's not even clear whether they lived or didn't live. And how they died from vodka or something else is unclear. And then they're simply gone. Did they live or not? Their life somehow slipped away unnoticed. But your son lived, do you understand? His purpose was fulfilled. That means he didn't pass away in vain. His life proved meaningful. It achieved a result. After ritual condolence in the beginning of this quote, Putin depersonalized death, blurring the line between politically produced death and natural mortality. We are all under the Lord, distancing himself in the state, therefore, from responsibility. But then he distinguished between meaningless and meaningful death. Those who die from accident or alcohol slip away unnoticed, as if their lives barely register. By contrast, the son who died in Putin's war didn't pass away in vain. His death achieved a result and fulfilled his purpose. Putin leaves both the result and the purpose entirely unspecified. The unsettling message is that giving one's life for the state is meaningful in itself, with no purpose and justification required. This moment crystallizes the central question of my talk. Why has sacrifice, stripped of purpose, become the privileged channel through which meaning and belonging are produced in Putin's Russia? To answer it, I turn to a thinker who understood something about sacrifice and its connection to sovereignty that many standard frameworks of sovereignty miss, Georges Bataille, French philosopher. In his account of sacrifice, Bataille draws on classical anthropology to show how sacrifice can become meaningful in itself, regardless of purpose. In their classic 1899 book, Sacrifice, Its Nature and Functions, Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss identified three positions in the sacrificial ritual. The sacrificer, who authorizes the offering, the victim, who is destroyed, and the community that is witnessing the act. What makes sacrifice meaningful, they stressed, is not the destruction of the victim for a goal, but the staging of the ritual itself, as a relational process in which all participants become reconfigured. Bataille retains this triadic structure of sacrifice, but expands its political significance. He defines sacrifice as purposeless expenditure, destruction that is meaningful precisely because it serves no utility. By exposing life to death without purpose, sacrifice moves it into a zone of the sacred, beyond rational calculation. In this sacred zone, set apart from instrumental reason, sovereign authority is constituted. The sovereign, Bataille says, is not the one who maximizes outcomes, but the one who can authorize death and destruction without needing purpose and justification. And sovereignty is not merely expressed through sacrifice, it is constituted by it. Before applying this to Putin's system, one further point needs to be made clear, the point about the relation between cultivation and destruction of life, and between biopower and sacrificial sovereignty, as I call it. So Foucault's biopower, as we know, describes governance organized around optimizing life, fostering the health, reproduction, and productivity of populations. At first glance, Putin's system might seem like the exact opposite, one that wastes and destroys life. But in fact, the relationship is more complex and more troubling than simple inversion. The state invests considerably in cultivating life. It pays mother's capital to encourage childbirth, gives the children of war contractors and veterans priority access to childcare, education, and housing, and cultivates the next generation through the DNA of Russia initiatives. These are recognizably biopolitical mechanisms. But the relation of power here is different. In Foucault's account, biopower supplements and partially displaces sovereign authority. The older power to take life gives way to the modern imperative to foster it. In Putin's system, by contrast, sovereign power does not recede. It captures and subordinates biopower, redirecting it towards its own ends, with biopower kind of nested within the structures of sacrificial sovereignty. Life is cultivated not as an end, but as a means. It is optimized at the level of reproduction to be sacrificed at the level of sovereign power. As a sardonic Russian saying puts it, women will bear new ones, бабы новых нарожают, a phrase that captures the state's simultaneous care and indifference to human life and underpins its systemic sacrificial replenishment of soldiers. Putin's system is also sometimes described as necropolitics, in Achille Mbembe's sense, as a configuration in which death operates as a technology of governance. But in fact, it differs from necropolitics in two important respects. First, Mbembe ties death to clear political ends, whereas Putin's war is not anchored in a stable purpose. Second, and here I will quote, in Mbembe's necropolitics, exposure to death is a technology of power that operates through exclusion, dividing population into those deemed human and those cast outside the human and therefore killable. In Putin's system, by contrast, exposure to death is framed as incorporation into a civilizational whole, as the ultimate sign of belonging. Therefore, neither Bataille nor Mbembe alone are sufficient to describe Putin's system. Bataille gives us the logic of purposeless sacrifice, but not the modern state apparatus that sustains it at scale. Mbembe gives us death as a technology of power, but the one that operates through exclusion, whereas Putin's system operates through inclusion. To grasp this configuration of power in Putin's system, we need an account that draws on both, but goes further. I call the specific configuration of power in Putin's system sacrificial sovereignty. This is a form of power in which purposeless sacrifice at mass scale becomes the organizing principle of governance. Here, exposure to death is not exclusion, but incorporation. As I said, the ultimate proof of civilizational belonging. Dying and killing for the civilization, or being drawn into its sacrificial logic on the home front, becomes meaningful in itself. It achieves a result, as Putin puts it. This logic extends directly to dissent. Within the civilizational frame, opposition to the state is seen not as a contestable political position or opinion, or even a crime, but a betrayal of one's nature. Putin calls opposition unnatural and disgusting. The logic of political contestation gives way to a logic of pathological mutation in which excision becomes the primary mode of response. This is why even minimal acts of dissent, wearing a no war pin, posting a critical comment on social media, placing a like on the critical post, are prosecuted under charges such as justification of terrorism or discrediting the armed forces, carrying prison sentences between 7 and 15 years. What is at stake is not the policing of opinions, but the maintenance of the healthy civilizational organism. Here, the triadic structure of sacrifice is reproduced, the one which Bataille took from anthropology. Putin appears as sacrificer, soldiers and civilians as victims, society as witness and participant, with every party transformed in the process. Sacrificial sovereignty is a technology of governance, institutionalized through the modern state apparatus. Nowhere is this more visible than in the system of war contracts through which the Russian state has sustained its losses at the front. The scale of loss is staggering. By March 2026, estimates placed Russian military deaths between 300,000 and 350,000, with Ukrainian military loss around 165,000 soldiers. To sustain losses at this scale without nationwide mobilization, the state developed a system of war contracts. Contractors are civilians who enlist by signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Each region in the country receives a quota from the center, with consequences for local officials who fail to meet it. Recruiters receive bonuses for each contract assigned. Most contractors come from disadvantaged groups and depressed regions. Many are over 40, and now the growing number is over 60. A 2022 law allowed prisoners to enlist for amnesty, and a 2023 law extended this to those under criminal investigation. Young conscripts in mandatory military service are pressed into signing war contracts under false assurances that they will remain in rare positions. But once on the front, many are sent into frontal assaults. Contractors are the largest and least trained group and the most likely to be killed. Approximately 20% of contractors are killed within a year, meaning the system continuously consumes and replaces tens of thousands of lives as its normal operation. At the same time, most men sign war contracts on a formally voluntary basis, driven by extraordinary high payments. In February 2026, the bonus for signing a contract in St. Petersburg reached 4 million rubles, which is about $50,000, although, of course, this kind of translations are only partially meaningful. With a monthly frontline salary of 210,000 rubles, which is $2,500, and additional operational bonuses, some contractors could earn up to 7 or 8 million rubles, or $90,000 to $100,000 annually. Contractors also have their credit debts cancelled. If a contractor is killed, his family receives between 10 and 15 million rubles, which is $160,000 to $190,000 in compensation. These figures far exceed anything these men can earn in civilian life. In 2024, over 400,000 men signed war contracts. In 2025, the figure was a little smaller but similar. State propaganda frames the war contract simultaneously as profitable employment, masculine self-fulfillment, and sacrificial duty. Billboard messages read, for example, "Victory will be ours. Hurry to claim all benefits and payouts. Salary $210,000 a month. Become a hero. Debt consolation up to 10 million. Be worthy of your great ancestors. Write off debt up to 10 million. Want to make money like a real man? Contract service is a way to provide for your family, pay your debts, and repay credit loans." Just, I'm sure many of you have seen it. Just examples how these billboards look in the cities across Russia. These messages use two frames to construct a subject whose life becomes meaningful and dignified, something he was previously denied. The first frame presents war as a financial transaction. The man is urged to be a rational actor who makes a shrewd choice, selling his life at the highest available price. What the state purchases is not labor, but his willingness to die and to kill in a war whose goals and justifications remain opaque. The second frame casts participation in terms of heroic identity and familial care. Men fight not against something, but for something, not against a defined threat, but for family and children. Across both frames, the literal meaning of the war is withheld. Who is the enemy and what constitutes victory? Like, victory will be ours. and I lost my place. Okay. Again, across both frames, literal meaning of both of the war is withheld. Who is the enemy and what constitutes victory is unspecified. Life becomes meaningful, heroic, moral, valuable through sacrifice as such. To kill and be killed without clear justification. It is crucial to hear how war contractors themselves describe their decisions. In 2024, journalists for the independent outlet Verstka spoke with dozens of men arriving to sign contracts at a couple Moscow recruitment centers. One middle-aged man said, "I've lived enough, but with this money I can buy an apartment for my son. If I am killed, so be it." Another signed because 3 of my comrades have already died there. When asked whether the war was just, he replied, "How can any war be just? If we were defending our borders, maybe, but we went into someone else's territory." A third had signed to honor his son, who served 7 months at the front, then came home and committed suicide. A storekeeper said, "I want to sign to provide for my children. One is turning 4 and my eldest daughter is 17. The director of a wood processing plant needed 35,000 rubles for his father's cancer surgery. We already mortgaged our house for 20 million. Now I came here." A production line assembler said, "The war is a political decision and it's not for me to decide. Maybe it's fair, maybe it's unfair. But salaries in Russia are low. If I earned 200,000 rubles a month, I wouldn't go." When journalists returned recently in February 2026 to these centers, responses had shifted further. A young man from a village in the Sverdlovsk region, out of work for more than a year, when asked what the war was about, said he didn't know. When pressed, "You don't know what it is about, but you want to risk your life for this?" He said simply yes. A bricklayer from Nizhny Novgorod region, also out of work for months, said the invasion was unjust. When asked why he was going to an unjust war, he replied, "I don't know, I want to be a patriot." These accounts reveal more than economic desperation. When a man calls the war unjust, but says he wants to be a patriot, this is not contradiction. The two statements belong to different registers. Patriotism, like caring for one's children, honoring the dead, restoring dignity in the eyes of one's family or community, it's a reason to sign a war contract, but paradoxically not to support the war. These reasons are rooted in relationships, obligations, love, the desire to belong. They also reflect a fatalistic resignation, audible in such phrases as "I have lived enough," and "if I'm killed, so be it," which expresses not despair so much as acceptance. The war is here, it is larger than me, and I must make something of it. The state seeks to produce, and often succeeds, a subject who consents to die and to kill without knowing why. This is sacrificial sovereignty, as I call it, in practice. By signing the contractor doesn't exercise power, but surrenders to it, offering his life for a war whose purpose cannot be named. The state does more than recruit. It first produces conditions of desperation, debt, loss, grief, desire to belong, and then converts them into fuel for sacrifice. Once on the front, contractors encounter another dimension of sacrificial sovereignty. There, contractors enter a predatory parallel economy in which officers often extort a portion of their contract payments. Refusal to pay can lead to deployment to the most dangerous assaults, where risk of being killed is highest. Deaths often go unreported so that officers can continue collecting payments. This reveals something structural about purposeless sacrifice. Once sacrifice is detached from defined purpose, it no longer requires accountability. The body becomes site of double extraction, first of life and then of material resources, with the logic of sacrificial sovereignty cascading downward through the hierarchy. This is not a corruption of sacrificial sovereignty the state has set in motion. It is its logical extension. How should we think in ethical terms about these men? We cannot ignore that they go to war where they will kill Ukrainian soldiers and civilians and participate in the occupation of Ukrainian territory. Their responsibility is real and cannot be excused. However, focusing exclusively on individual responsibility risks obscuring something essential. Moral judgment presupposes freedom, the capacity to act from one's reason rather than from coercion or manufactured necessity. Under conditions of poverty, debt, fear of punishment, restricted information, and pervasive propaganda, the space of judgment is narrowed, even if never entirely foreclosed. Hannah Arendt's distinction between personal responsibility and political responsibility is useful here. The contractor bears personal responsibility for the violence he participates in, while political responsibility extends to the regime that has engineered the conditions that make such actions appear possible and meaningful. These men's decisions remain, however misguidedly, within a moral universe oriented towards relations of care, obligation to the dead, love of country, and the pursuit of dignity. When they say the war is a political decision and it's not for me to decide, they are not expressing nihilism, but delegating political judgment to the sovereign, which allows them to preserve other forms of meaning associated with family, worth, and belonging. It resembles what I described in earlier work as living veneer, or inside and outside the system, inhabiting the state's formal structures while withholding full identification with their meanings. What Putin's regime has achieved is not the elimination of ethical agency, but its reorganization, binding it to purposeless sacrifice. The widespread narrative of complicity, the question, why don't Russians just refuse, completely misses this reorganization, unfortunately. It presupposes a subject whose moral convictions are grounded in the field of free choices. What sacrificial sovereignty produces instead is a subject whose ethical life remains genuine and oriented towards human values, but whose field of action has been so thoroughly constricted by the state that for many, those values can only be expressed through the war contract. The choices described above are neither merely individual nor merely imposed from the sovereign center. They are also social, diffused through shared norms, collective habits, and the efforts of ordinary people to maintain a livable life at a distance from the war. How then is the war lived inside Russia, actually? And can we take the absence of mass protests as evidence of broad support, as one hears a lot? Claims about widespread support are frequent in both Western and Russian media, often backed by opinion polls. But in this context, polling data doesn't register what it claims to register. Even the most rigorous polling organizations cannot escape the fact that discourse has been shaped by pervasive authoritarian power. Take just one trivial example, the word war. This word has been criminalized and cannot be uttered when framing questions, shaping the exchange in ways that cannot be measured. But the point, however, is not this. It's not just one word, it's the whole discursive field. More importantly, as Charles Taylor argued, the polling situation in general presupposes a subject that he calls bound itself, with stable pre-existing attitudes that can be extracted when prompted. But speech doesn't work this way. It doesn't simply report internal states. It also positions speakers within the social and moral field. When a respondent says they support the army, it may express not a considered political position, but care for a drafted relative, an attempt to minimize risk, a desire to preserve dignity, a desire to sound like others one wants to belong with, or a delegation of political judgment to the state. This explains why many polls reveal an apparent paradox. A majority in these polls claim to support the war, and at the same time, a majority also claim they want the war to end. These are not contradictory positions, just like in the previous example. They are situated speech acts oriented towards different social registers. At times, the register of personal care and risk. At other times, that of public language shaped by state discourse and oriented towards national belonging. Similarly, the absence of mass protests does not necessarily index support, but rather the system's success in making dissent costly, political purpose opaque, and the war an inescapable condition of existence. A deeper problem lies beyond the structural reach of polls. As Nigel Thrift has argued in his non-representational theory, research based on representative samples assumes people are stable objects equipped with beliefs, overlooking the fact that humans are processual beings in perpetual emergence and transformation. A poll captures what respondents say they do when asked in a particular moment, under particular constraints. What such models miss is what people are capable of doing, capacities that remain latent until the conditions that activate them arise. To understand how Russians actually live with the war, we must turn to ethnographic research. Since 2022, a team known as Public Sociology Lab, maybe many of you have heard about them by now, PS Lab, has conducted ongoing ethnographic fieldwork research in multiple regions of the country. In the first weeks after the invasion, they found widespread shock and disbelief across the country, followed by disorientation and depression. Early expressions of opposition were quickly squashed through harsh criminalization, while genuine grassroots mobilization in support of the war was actually rare from the outset. Over the following 3 years, Russian society became increasingly depoliticized rather than mobilized. In contexts perceived as safe, people often blamed the state, let them fight their own war. But discussing geopolitics or sanctions, the same individuals may shift registers into a patriotic one, insisting that Russia needs to defend itself. These shifts are not contradictions in any context. They are responses to uncertainty, moral ambiguity, the struggle to maintain a normal life under authoritarianism. Wartime volunteerism also expanded. For example, collecting supplies for the front or weaving camouflage nets and other things. And this is often explained as signs of mass mobilization for the war. But ethnographers who volunteered for the same activities report that motivations are overwhelmingly local and personal, helping a relative on the front survive, coping with personal loss, maintaining social ties. Patriotic rhetoric at these activities is rare and actively avoided. In everyday conversations, Ukraine, including its occupied territories, is referred to as a country, as a separate entity with its own cultural and linguistic identity. What PS Lab ethnographers document is neither straightforward complicity, nor clear support, nor explicit opposition, but depoliticization. Depoliticization is itself a form of sacrifice, not of physical life, but of political agency, moral clarity, public engagement. It is also a way of living alongside a war one cannot stop, performing required gestures while withholding commitment. It is precisely this condition that creates the space for the form of politics to which I turn in conclusion. Atmosphere. The regime's doctrine of this civilizational state requires not just obedience, but affective identification, subjects who experience the civilizational body as their own. Yet what the preceding analysis reveals is not identification, but fragmentation, depoliticization, withdrawal. In the gap between proclaimed civilizational unity and lived fragmentation, another kind of politics has taken shape in wartime Russia. This politics is not articulated or organized. It exists as a shared sensibility of distance and refusal that has not found, and under present conditions cannot find, stable political expression. The concept that best captures this condition is what I call atmosphere, drawing on the work of philosopher Gernot Böhme and recent work in anthropology and cultural geography by people like Kathleen Stewart, Ben Anderson, and others. Atmosphere is not a feeling inside individuals and not a property of things, nor is it a social movement or ideology. Rather, it is a shared quality of affect that emerges in the space between bodies and their surroundings, a diffuse condition where there is sense collectivity before it is articulated, organized, or named. What does this look like in practice? And what does it offer our analysis of political sensibilities in Russia? Consider one example. In 2025, as I'm sure many of you know, an 18-year-old musician, Diana Loginova, performing under the stage name Naoka, regularly played on the streets of St. Petersburg with the guitarist and the drummer, covering songs by Russian musicians some of which were associated with political opposition. Passers-by, mostly young people, not exclusively, stopped. Crowds formed spontaneously, several dozen, sometimes 100. Many began singing along, moving in rhythm and recognizing in one another something unexpected, not an organized collectivity with a program, but a shared sensibility that had seemed private and now became perceptible in the faces and bodies of strangers. This is what I call, this is what in this analytical approach is called atmospheric attunement. Bodies falling into affective synchrony with one another without prior organization or intention, making the shared sensibility briefly and collectively perceptible. Videos of these spontaneous gatherings circulated widely online. In October 2025, Nauka and her musicians were arrested. 2 songs were cited by the authorities. The first, Soldier and Poet by Monetichka, addresses a soldier in an unnamed war. You are a soldier, and whatever war you choose to fight, forgive me, I'll be on the opposite side. In 2025, the reference to this war was unmistakable, though never explicitly stated. The second song, Swan Lake Cooperative by Noise MC, includes the line, I want to see the ballet play, let the white swans dance today. For Russian audiences, this is immediately legible. Swan Lake was broadcast during Soviet political crisis after the deaths of top party leaders during the 1991 coup attempt. To wish the swans dance again is to wish, without saying so, for the death of the autocrat and the end of the regime. In both songs, political meaning travels through euphemism, widely recognized yet formally deniable. The performance and this spontaneous sing-along operated less through representation than through affect, evoking a shared feeling that exceeded what could be openly stated. Staging public prosecution for such events is also difficult. Officials want to be legal, so the charge just shifted from discrediting the armed forces to organizing an unauthorized mass event that obstructed pedestrian traffic. The defense replied that gatherings were spontaneous and therefore not organized. Both sides relied on euphemism. The musicians avoided naming their performances political, not to invite prosecution. But the state also avoided referring to the gatherings as protest, for this would be an admission that spontaneous opposition to war exists below the surface. What the state feared was not lyrical content, but the emergence of a space in which dispersed individuals recognized that the others felt something similar without organization, leadership, or naming. So what is the evidentiary status of these gatherings? A skeptical listener may ask, can one street musician tell us anything beyond herself? Answering this requires distinguishing between 2 forms of analysis. One looks for representative attitudes, dispositions that are already visible and can be articulated. The other focuses on symptoms, moments in which otherwise hidden processes become perceptible before they can be named. As Nigel Frick again argues, representationalist models tend to miss what is still in emergence, what remains latent until conditions arise that activate it, not only what people say they do, but what they're capable of doing. Representationalist approaches, for example, did not register famously the conditions that made the Soviet Union collapse, which is why it appeared so sudden and unexpected, because these conditions were latent and unarticulated, and thus largely invisible to analytical frameworks that focus on signs of visible, organized opposition. Events such as the Nauka gatherings do not show what Russians say in service. They show what ordinary people can become capable of doing under certain conditions, not a stable opinion, but an emergent capacity. When we detect a fever, we detect a symptom. It doesn't tell us how much of the body is ill, but it tells us that something real is happening beneath the surface. Spontaneous atmospheric attunements, such as this, are also symptoms of a political capacity that exceeds what I earlier described as depoliticized withdrawal. It would be a mistake to dismiss such events as isolated or proverbial anecdotal evidence that doesn't follow a measurable distribution. Symptoms are not anecdotal phenomena. They do not arise out of nothing. They condense a diffuse condition that is already present, but not yet visible or articulated. For strangers to gather spontaneously, recognize something in one another, and fall into affective resonance without coordination, a shared sensibility must already be in place. What appears sudden is supported by a prior, largely unarticulated affective field that becomes suddenly perceptible in these moments. The recurrence of such symptoms is also important. Similar affective responses emerge in different places among different people without prior organization. Such symptoms are already visible even in the material which I examined earlier in the talk. The contractors who call the war unjust but sign anyway. The volunteers who participate while avoiding patriotic language. The contradictory statements and shifts between registers of speech documented by PS Lab, which to some of us appear funny until we start analyzing them. These phenomena do not point to organized political mobilization, but they do point to a latent form of political life, to what people are already capable of doing once conditions change. Political life displaced from overt and sustained forms of expression, but not fully extinguished. This is the emergent capacity I will return to in conclusion. The regime of sacrificial sovereignty I have described in this talk is a form of authoritarian governance. What makes it distinct is not only that it deploys exposure to death as a technology of power, but that it does so in the form of purposeless sacrifice, making exposure to death the ultimate proof of civilizational belonging. And yet, what this analysis has also revealed is that the system creates not just compliance and depoliticization, but also the conditions for a latent form of political life. While the regime has succeeded in producing bodies available for sacrifice and gestures of compliance at the level of speech, ritual, and formal contract, it has not produced full identification with the sacrificial logic as a lived moral orientation. The result is a society that lives alongside its own political life, neither fully inside nor fully outside the state's purpose. As the late Soviet experience suggests, such conditions can persist for extended periods, producing the appearance of stability. But that experience also suggests that political rupture does not always require prior mass mobilization from below. It may require only the right conditions under which the emergent political capacity crystallizes, becoming collectively visible and publicly legible. When that happens, what had appeared as depoliticized passivity, or was measured by polls as broad support, may reveal itself as accumulated political potential, not what people say they do, but what they're capable of doing. And what had appeared as stability may turn out to have been only an interval before rapid unraveling. Thank you.
Professor Yurchak, thank you so much for this
Yurchak.
brilliant Yurchak, I'm sorry. And in Russian, how you would say?
Yurchak.
Also Yurchak?
Конечно.
Okay. I'm sorry.
And
For
in
this-
German too.
Huh?
In German, check.
Right. For this brilliant presentation, thank you for this brilliant presentation, but it's also an awfully scary one for some of us who are dreaming about returning back home to Moscow, to Russia.
I'm from St. Petersburg.
You're from St. Peter, right?
I'm not returning to Moscow.
Huh? So, Professor Sloskin basically returned back to Russia. I didn't prevent him. Anyway, I have, some questions and then, I will
He
ask.
lives in Riga.
Huh?
He lives near Riga.
Yeah, but he receives money in Moscow.
He what?
Anyway, we're not doing, don't fight. Yes.
I just saw him in Berkeley.
Oh, really?
Collecting.
Okay. Yes, he's a Putin loyalist now. Anyway, so
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions and then I will give the space to this lovely audience. So I assume they have a lot of questions. Talking about, the sovereign sacrifice, you use these two words, very powerful words. What do you exactly, but I have trouble, have difficulty to understand exactly what you mean, because when I've been trying to translate it into Russian, it's something like священная жертва, сакральная жертва, none of that.
I'm talking about sacrificial sovereignty. So
You use
sacrificial,
sovereign sacrifice.
yeah, but
So the sovereign is a king.
sacrificial sovereignty.
Ага.
So sacrificial is жертвенное, sovereignty, суверенитет, жертвенный суверенитет.
What does it mean?
It means that the system of sovereign power is produced and reproduced through a regime which is sacrificial, which shapes human life as a form of sacrifice, and by means of sacrifice reproduces the position of the sovereign and the position of the regime around him. So it's like any other form of political governance. It's a scary one. It's a very brutal one. It's connected to the classical systems of sacrificial monarchies, which we know from classical anthropology. And it, of course, has been reshaped through the operations of the modern state on scale, with these contracts, with this mass propaganda, with this mass implication of society into this sacrificial logic. So it becomes modern, but based on this pre-modern logic, which is the case with all modern states. So in other words, it's a form of political governance, sacrificial sovereignty.
Is it but wait a second, any war comes to an end sooner or later.
Mhm.
Is it to say that this war is going to go forever? Or is it to say that, when the war will be over, that will be the collapse of the regime?
No, neither. Sacrificial sovereignty doesn't require one form of sacrifice. It can be the sacrifice of purposeless sacrifice of lives on the front. But once this is over, it can restructure sacrifice differently. Sacrifice as constantly mobilizing society for being defending itself from the external threat from the West and so forth. There are many different forms. Even today, one element of it is on the front, but there's a lot of, as I was given examples, elements of this sacrificial logic within the state itself, within civilian life. So this is not a war machine. War machine is a very important productive element of that system, but it's not necessarily required to be constantly played out on the front. I hope it will be over, but that's a different point. Your point was structural. You asked me a structural question whether sacrificial sovereignty presupposes a constant sacrifice of life on scale on the front, and I think not necessarily, even though it makes it very easy, possible.
If sacrificial sovereignty is a form of governance, then why Russian authorities prefer not to recruit people in Moscow and St. Peter, and prefer to recruit people in the most impoverished parts of Russia?
Well, just as I was explaining, the people who are the most vulnerable, who are already put in the position where this vulnerability and precarity can be turned into fuel for sacrifice, are the most likely to go and kill and die without necessarily having to ask why.
Of course, this I understand.
No, but this is the reason. And if you start doing, for example, even before we go into Petersburg, Moscow, and big cities, just the idea of mass mobilization, why they don't want that. Because as we know from the 2022, but also they know from all sorts of other science, that will create a kind of discourse which will be not based on this purposeless sacrifice. There will be questions why. There will be questions, and these questions are exactly the ones that they're trying to avoid. The reason I went to Bataille is that he very interestingly, drawing on this anthropological studies of sacrifice, shows that sacrifice is not done for purpose. It's done, or rather, the purpose of sacrifice is not utilitarian logic of what it creates. It rather reconstitutes the society which witnesses it. It transforms the social world. It reproduces the position of the sovereign. So this is why he calls it purposeless sacrifice. That's the most important logic in the sacrificial machinery. And I think this is the central one in Putin's war, which is why I started with the discussion of the fact that it's very difficult to pinpoint the reasons. They constantly change. And it's not confusion, and it's not necessarily even design. It's just that the reasons are secondary. The war is important simply as itself. It's important because of the endurance of the war itself, because that sacrificial logic reproduces the system. It reproduces the position of the sovereign. And we see more and more of it. Anyway, yeah.
I understand this, but you cannot have, if you say it's a form of governance, you cannot have one form of governance for the rural areas, like Gorno Altai, Buryatia, Tuva, and etc., where they recruit the Yakutia. These regions are basically, they deprived of mail now. They don't have enough mail anymore because they're killed. And to have another form of governance in the big cities, like
It's the same. It's the same form of governance. There's no contradiction at all to what I'm saying. I'm saying that sacrificial sovereignty includes not only dying on the front. I said it already several times. It includes all sorts of other engagements, right? The implication, everyone is implicated in the war. The economy is restructured. People, even who don't pay any attention, they have to walk by these billboards. They have to not say anything. It's full societal implication. And big cities are less balanced on the side of the front and physical extermination, and more on the side of the same sacrificial sovereignty, on the side of moral and other engagement. All of this together are part of the. You asked me, first question was, if the war ends, will it change? And I said no, because the front line extermination is not the only element of that governance, and same with the distinction between Bashkiria and Moscow.
On another topic, I translated for you the story from a person who is currently living in your city, in St. Peter, and who was summoned to KGB FSB. So she writes, a large portrait of Stalin hangs in the investigator's office. And in the corridor, a large Wagner flag. Of course, Wagner is, this paramilitary group, which started, some sort of a mutiny. Putin was frightened to death, ran out of Moscow. Anyway, everybody there. But in this KGB office, there is both Stalin and a flag of a company which allowed for mutiny, which was totally impossible under Stalin, of course. Another example, Center-Air, that's a well-known department for combating extremism. What they mean by extremism, of course, they mean dissent in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It's, basically an outpost of the KGB of FSB in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. In this investigator's office, in one corner, there were icons, and a lot of icons, and another nude woman. What you describe sounds to me as a pure pagan culture. This. Okay. What does this tell you, these symbols, I'm obviously referring to gifts. What do these symbols tell you about the state of culture in the contemporary Russia?
Well, I'm an anthropologist, so a question about state of culture is problematic to me.
Okay.
Because culture is not an object.
Interpretation of culture.
Citing
gifts.
That's guess from like 70 years ago. It's not really an object culture. These are not let's talk about the portrait of Stalin. Do we need to interpret that portrait as literal identification with Stalin? I love Stalin, this is why the portrait. No, this is an index, it's not a symbol. It's an index of the power which we hold, this complete power. Stalin is indexical of complete authoritarian power. Same with the nude woman with icons. The contradiction there is indexical of the fact that we hold complete power. So this contradiction doesn't really apply because we're above it. So these kind of things are, people walk with Stalin in protests, and it's all constantly interpreted in, I hope there's no one from New York Times, but in New York Times, Russians love Stalin. No, that's not what it means. It means something else. It means a reference, like if it's common people walking with Stalin in the demonstration, it often means we hate what has been done to us. And so this is an index of that. We were kids when Stalin died, or maybe even not born. So we never thought about him. Suddenly now we're walking with him. I interviewed some of those people in the 7th of November demonstrations in Petersburg, many times actually. They're always Stalin. They are not Stalinists. It's an index of something else. Same with all of this. I mean, as I said already, this Santa Air and the guy who is from the Ministry of Internal Affairs with Stalin picture, or with the nude woman and the icon. All of these are indexes of complete authoritarian power, meaning that we are the ones who is actually embodying it. Nothing else. Or rather, I shouldn't say nothing else. I should say that in order for me to interpret more, I would need to know more about these people. You're giving me very simple examples. So I don't know the context, I don't know who those people are, but that element is definitely there. So to interpret that as pagan culture is strange to me, because, you know, we can say, oh, Trump said this and Trump said that, America's pagan culture. Of course not. That's not how it works. We're not pagan culture. Every modern culture is replete with pagan symbols. It's completely, we're using it all the time. The whole ritual of introducing me, of clapping, all of that goes way back. It doesn't make us pagan. Sorry. So all of that, in other words, we need to be kind of open. Russia somehow invites these interpretations because it's Russia. And I want to resist that.
You know,
As an anthropologist, not as a Russian.
as you well aware, the founder of the VCK, the political police that, you know, went through stages and different acronyms, and now it's, you know, FSB. So he was a bloody founder of this organization, which was bloody from the start till now. And just recently, its Academy of FSB, got back its name of Dzerzhinsky. Once again, became Academy of FSB, or Felix Dzerzhinsky. What does it tell you?
Okay, so the question is, in other words, if it's kind of similar to the question 20 years ago, Putin returned the Soviet anthem, reestablished, right? What does it tell us? Well, let's think about it for a second. What does it tell us? It can, I'm not saying I know what it tells me, even though I will try to interpret it in a second, but let's just do some comparative stuff. I'm a football fan, and I watch just yesterday, Arsenal was playing Atletico Madrid, and they played the British national anthem and the Spanish national anthem. British national anthem is God Save the King. Under this anthem, millions were killed all over the world. For some reason, that national anthem doesn't raise brows as Putin's reinstatement of old Soviet one with new lyrics does. That's just one thing. It's interesting. Let's pause for a second. And that's American history is full of that as well. That's just how states work. They draw on symbols which are historically important, which are very, and of course Putin manipulates them. I'm not saying it's innocent, but I'm just saying it's not unique. We are trying to interpret that as a unique thing. What does it tell you about? Well, it tells me about the state. It doesn't tell me about Russia. The state works that way. Any state works that way. Look at the Dutch democracy. They have the king and the queens to this day. Again, what did they do in Indonesia under royalty? For some reason, they still celebrate those king and queen. The journals are full of their pictures. In other words, let's go back now to interpretation what the picture of Dzerzhinsky means. The picture of Dzerzhinsky is also an index of this powerful political leg of the state, which the Secret Service represents. And it's grounded, of course, in revolution. Dzerzhinsky is not simply an index of bloody operation, which he is. He's also an index of all those ideals and hopes which revolution stood for as well. It's ridiculous to reduce Russian history to just blood, because it's also betrayed hopes, and those hopes, people died for those hopes. So for many people, Dzerzhinsky, also maybe less so Stalin, would be an index of that as well. So it tells me that it's a complex story, in other words.
Okay, my last question from my side. What symbols are used in Putin's Russia, and can their origins be traced back to those that existed in the USSR or in the culture of the Russian Empire?
Sorry, a little bit lost focus. Can you say it again?
I'm asking, about the symbols that are used in Putin's Russia,
Right.
and including your sacrificial sovereignty.
Yeah.
To which, Soviet Union went through this awful World War II in which 27 million Russians or Soviet people were killed, right? And it was real sacrifice, but there was a real purpose. They were defending their families, their country.
Yeah.
So even though, some of the deeds of the Soviet army in Europe were awful and brutal and anyway. But, I'm just curious to, Putin, I cannot believe that Putin invented something, he probably got those symbols from the Soviet past or
Which
from the imperial, sacrifice. Or,
No.
war without purpose.
This is not how it works. It's not like someone sat down and said, you know what we'll do? We'll do a sacrificial sovereignty system. No. This is a structural argument. It's not a psychological argument. It's not someone's psychological or cognitive design. The system structurally organized itself that way, and it's a system in which what Putin does embody is complete disregard for human life, and
But it's always been, a feature of the Russian history
and American history. I mean, America, Manifest Destiny. Hello, anyone? 20 million locals wiped out. It's a history. It's a nature of modern state. It's not a nature. I mean, maybe you can start arguing this number is bigger than this number. Okay, but that's not the point, right? The point is, this is how modern states work. They work through violence, colonization, grabbing the territories, and the structural element of that system in Putin's Russia mutated into this sacrificial sovereignty. It wasn't designed that way. And as you know, the war was supposed to end in 3 days. Once it didn't.
No, it's not, by the way, it's a myth.
Or maybe it's
supposed to end at the end of August 2022 with occupation.
Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that the war was not designed to be what it is now. It mutated into something along the way. And that something is a structural mutation, right? So the one which we are having today is what I'm describing. It doesn't mean that someone sat and designed it and then followed. And that's not how it ever works. As for Soviet, you asked me what he borrowed from the Soviet. Putin's regime is profoundly anti-Soviet, profoundly anti-Soviet. He hates the idea of creating a bright future, of creating equality, of creating some kind of social contract, of creating a communist type of subject. All of that is complete anathema to him. He might draw from some forms of violent institutional organization of Stalinist period, yes. But he can also so easily draw from others. He can draw from American system. He can draw from Chinese system. He can draw from Ivan the Terrible. So he draws from different ones, like it happens in history. It's definitely not a reconstruction of the Soviet project in any shape or form. And he doesn't think about the future. He constantly addresses himself to the civilizational nature, which is ahistorical and grounded in this space outside of time. You cannot pinpoint where it started. It started somewhere outside of history, right? This is why he talks about DNA. This is why he talks about code. All of those things are so much, they are justified because they're outside of history. They don't need to be genealogically traced. They are already there. And that's totally not Soviet. Soviet is completely different, remaking the Soviet people, making them ethical, making them claiming that human nature is malleable and could and will live up to its full potential one day. It's completely different ontology. So I don't think he borrows very much. He borrows from the institutional violence and those things, yes. But as I said, he doesn't need to go to Soviet Union alone for that. He could go to many different places, to racism, to colonialism, to many places.
Thank you so much. Yes, please.
If there is no, thank you for the wonderful talk. I so much to think about.
Is it possible for you guys to introduce yourself? Not to surveil, but I'm just very curious. Mhm.
You said that there is no goal, and the goal is not necessary at all. If there is no goal, then it's impossible to reach it, and that means the war will never end.
Well, that's the question which was asked.
Yeah, but also you mentioned that the war, when the war ends, something happens. But how will it end if there is no goal? And if
Yeah.
reach
I should just clarify. I didn't say there's no goal. I said purposeless. It's not the same thing. The goal is to create this authority. No. The goal, in the way you are asking me about, it will never end. The goal is to create the system which reproduces itself as authoritarian with a particular sovereign structure. That's the goal. The goal is the creation, the remaking of Russian society. And by the way, it also extends to Ukraine, because I am writing a longer piece for publication, which I had to cut out because of this limits of this particular framework. But I have a whole big section there about Ukraine, because Ukraine is also subjected to this violent murder and destruction through the lens of the same incorporation rather than exclusion, like in Bembe. The kind of brothers who forgot their identity, who need to be brought back into the civilizational fold. Even Ukrainian kids who were brought to Russia and put into the детские дома and into families, the whole argument is still the same. It's the reuniting with. This claim of the Putin system is incorporation into this whole. So that's the goal. The goal is to create that society which will operate according to this system of completely authoritarian sovereign structure. As for the purpose of sacrifice, it is in every concrete case, you can say there's a reason they died for this village, for this town, they died for Putin. But in fact, that is not in focus. You don't need to focus on what is the purpose of sacrifice. Sacrifice is meaningful in itself. That's what I'm saying. So the goal is there. The goal is creation of this authoritarian state. Yes, please.
Thank you for this great lecture. I'm Alexander. I'm a second year PhD in history, Columbia. So what are key differences between sacrificial sovereignty and classical discourses on nationhood?
Yeah.
Because Ernest Renan in his foundational essay argued that the common grief produced the nation, first and foremost. And we have extensive scholarly literature about the role of victimhood in nation building. And of course, Khrushchev and other meaning makers never use the concept of nation, they use concept of civilization, but Count Uvarov also avoided the concept of nationality. He used народность, but we don't confused by this avoidance. What is the difference here?
Yeah, the difference is, thank you for the question. The difference is very important in that civilizational discourse is not nationalist discourse. There's a big distinction between civilizational, and that's an important difference. Because nationalist discourse produces, just like with Mbembe's necropolitics, which I talked about. I didn't talk about nationalism, but I will have a section in the paper. It works through exclusion, friend, enemy. It's constant production of enemies. That's what nationalism is based on. Putin's system is not focusing on that. It doesn't talk about, it doesn't single out Ukrainians living in Russia as racially inferior or as people to persecute. It doesn't. And there's none of that. So it doesn't work through the exclusion, drawing a boundary of exclusion between these national groups, as nationalism, all nationalisms do in different ways. It works through incorporation. It's incorporation of us into the civilizational whole. And in this case, Ukrainians are also incorporated through murder. I'm not saying it's a peaceful process. It's a very violent destruction. But as I said in the beginning of the talk, this exposure to death is the biggest proof of belonging. That's what makes Putin's system so unique but also so bloody. Right? It's exactly the exposure to death which is the proof of your civilization belonging. That's why if you sign a contract and you don't understand why, and you just go and kill yourself and others, that's the ultimate belonging. And then they're celebrated in those cemeteries. So that's a big difference.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Kirill.
Hello, do you think this sacrificial sovereignty would be possible without benefits and money? And is this war unique in terms of the scale of benefits and money in Russian and world history? I keep thinking about that and try to find examples in Soviet history, Russian imperial history, so that the state would pay so much to buy a body, because that's at least that's how I see it. You buy a body to use it.
Right. Well, two things. First of all, no, it's not unique. Like everything else I've been saying, it's not unique. It appears to us that it's unique because we're so focused on Russia. It's not unique. Look at the American army. People are paid $100,000 a year. They go to wars which they don't understand. They fight Iran and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to say it's similar. I'm just saying this technique, the modern scale production of sacrifice as a form of governance is the technique of the modern state. What makes Putin's system unique is that people are dying without even knowing what the war is for, right? So there is this, because in American discourse, there is this idea that we are fighting as the leaders of the free world, we are fighting for democracy, we're fighting against Iran having nuclear weapons and so forth. As for the, yes, I think I answered both things, right? So the first one was that what makes it so special is that this is the technique of the modern state, which uses this sacrificial logic, this purposeless sacrifice, which is actually very pre-modern logic. It doesn't make the state somehow pagan or somehow underdeveloped. It's just that states draw on those logics everywhere. So it uses this pre-modern logic and then multiplies it on this mass scale through the apparatus of the modern state, which includes huge payments. Oh yeah, so your question was, if there was not payments, what would happen? I think this is, I don't know, this is one of the technologies. As I said in the answers before, that this is not the only technology. It's one of the key. Payments is key because it produces precarity, it produces loss, it produces feelings of complete abandonment, and then it buys bodies which are already placed in those positions with this money, right? And offers care and love and belonging in exchange for sacrifice. So that is, of course, a unique configuration, but it's not unique in the sense that all states do something like this, right? In many wars. I mean, think about Vietnam. Think about, again, I'm only bringing American examples because I'm at NYU. If I was in Holland, I would draw on Indonesia. But the point is, this is definitely what happens with modern states. So that is not unique. What makes it unique is that we need to pay attention to how it is configured here, right? And it's also particularly cynical here, right? This idea that we don't have to know what for, because that is our civilizational nature. So you're doing it for belonging to civilization. So then everything else, any kind of logical explanation becomes, you can question, but it's secondary. You don't need to focus on it. And that's very cynical.
Yes, please.
No, thank you for your brilliant insights. I wanted to ask, my name is Albert. I wanted to ask, you were talking about the absence of the bounded self from the part of the population, and correct me if I'm wrong, this absence of the bound itself leads to kind of impossibility of accountability from the part of population. And I wanted to ask, does this absence also implies that this absence also mirrored by the absence of this bound itself from the part of the state or from the part of the state agents?
I think you misheard me. I didn't say anything about the absence of the bound itself. I said that polls presuppose that humans are bound themselves with preconceived ideas, preconceived opinions, which can be extracted when asked. And that's not how subjectivity works and not how language works. So the whole idea of the subject in opinion polls is fundamentally flawed. Sometimes that fundamental flawlessness, yeah, fundamental flaw. Sometimes this fundamental flaw of polls is not so important because they ask you about who you will vote next week. But in this case, when the question is what you think about this mega tragic situation, which is beyond your control and which you don't understand, and then you ask support, not support, that flaw is extremely important. So what we get, we don't know. I think all those Levada polls, in my opinion, they do show something, of course, but we have no idea how to interpret it. So whatever they say, I don't buy it. I read all of their interpretations. I don't know where they're coming from, those interpretations. I think you cannot possibly interpret those things until you do this sustained ethnographic research in that, especially in that context. And so that's why PS Lab to me is, they are the only ones who are really doing it. It's not, so the only reason I talked about bounded was in relation to polls. So I wasn't saying that somehow Russians are not bounded cells.
Yeah. Sasha?
I had a question. It's a very specific question, so I apologize for that. We had a presentation a few months ago from one of the researchers at PS Lab, who was specifically speaking about this aspect of their research.
Who was it?
Jakob Legier, he's a PhD student, a friend of mine in Amsterdam.
Right.
So yeah, his project was specifically focused on the wartime volunteers.
Mhm.
And so I was struck as you were speaking by the sort of the purposelessness. What he described was that a lot of these groups face quite significant pushback from local authorities. There's a lot of tension between them and local authorities. And that was surprising to me at first.
Yeah.
The first time I heard it, it was counterintuitive. It's not what I expected. And so my question for you then, and this is sort of getting into the nitty gritty, I guess, is should we then interpret that as being dangerous because it's not purposeless? So you perhaps you've read this work, what he described is that people are really building community through these activities. They go to the front, they describe their experiences on the front as life-changing and much more meaningful than anything they've experienced in their lives. And so, you know, even so this is actively facilitating sacrifice, a desire to make real sacrifice. Yeah. But it's really cultivating meaning and community as well, and in a quite politically powerful way. So I'm wondering.
I think we should, I think we should not throw around the word purposeless. We just took this word somehow, decontextualized it, and now we're using it. I'm not saying that they are involved in some purposeless activity. I was talking about purposeless sacrifice in relation to the fact that the war is conducted in such a way that it's almost impossible to pinpoint the reason, and it's constantly done that way. So sacrifice becomes defocused from purpose. It becomes meaningful in itself. That's what I was talking about, and that's part of the governing technology. Now, if you talk about volunteering groups about which I spoke, it's absolutely true that people are volunteering themselves. And as I was saying, one of the reasons they volunteer is not that they mobilize to support Putin. They mobilize often to support a relative who will die otherwise. They already experienced huge loss. So maybe their child died at the front and they need community. And they write about it in their reports. There's one section in the last report of PS Lab, which is I recommend everyone to read them, which is very touching. And they talk about what's happening in those volunteering sessions. Now, why the state finds it problematic. And that's exactly goes to my discussion of atmosphere. Atmospheres are those events which are spontaneous, which are not controlled by the state, and where a form of political agency or political sensibility become visible because people recognize each other. And they are recognizing each other not because they were organized by someone from above to say, we've letter Z all together and walk in a march, but because they did it spontaneously. And then they not only did it spontaneously, but unexpectedly to themselves, they recognized, and there was this resonance, affective resonance, right? So this is precisely why Naoka was so dangerous to them. So what if she thinks? Until there was no groups of people suddenly forming and dancing together and then seeking her out. She was not dangerous. The danger was that symptom, that actually there is this underlying sensibility where people can recognize each other and come into resonance. Same with volunteering. It's exactly the same. And that is another example, which is in my longer paper, where I talk about how the state kind of paradoxically, counterintuitively tries to suppress pro-war volunteering because it sees it as dangerous.
Yes, please.
There's some hands up in the back as well.
I am Ginny Watson. I'm in English and Comparative Literature here at NYU. Thank you so much for such a great talk. I was just really struck by that phrase that you mentioned about the women will bear new ones.
Yeah.
And that's part of this sacrificial logic. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about gender and subject formation. I'm wondering if part of your ethnographic research revealed something different about women's subject formation in this logic.
Yeah, I wish I did some ethnographic research on the war. I didn't. I must admit it's PS Lab. Last time I went to Russia was in March 2022 when the war started. I was there for family reasons and I had to leave and I haven't been since. So all of my ethnography, which has been for many, many years, suddenly stopped because of the war. So I cannot claim that this is my observations. It's PS Lab, and I think they are heroes, and they also do things which anthropologists sometimes find ethically problematic because they don't announce themselves. But what can you do in a situation like this? You don't say, I'm here to observe. Of course, because it's dangerous not only to you, but to them. Now about gender. Yeah, it's very gendered, of course, because the whole idea is that you have it's biopolitics, which is captured by this sovereign power, as I was saying, it's nested inside. So they actually very much promote the idea of having more children, of having families, and they talk about the fact that Russian, just like all European nations, population is declining because of low birth rate, that we need to do it, but it's constantly put within this logic of sacrifice, because even if you look at the programs which they push, they're connected to veterans, they're connected to people who were on the front, who were or somehow part of the industrial complex which works for the front. They have privileged biopolitical technologies directed at those. So in that sense, it's gendered because there is a war. It's a masculine thing, overwhelmingly, not completely, but overwhelmingly men on the front, and the men who die in these huge numbers, and women have to bear new ones. Yeah.
Professor Borenstein.
Borenstein. So thank you. I really appreciate your approach to subjectivity and politics, which seems to be about less of a continuous subject, but there's a momentary subject formation. I've wonderful, enjoyed the talk. But as I was listening to you talk, I found myself having the anxiety I have when I'm watching a movie where someone is returning to a haunted house. Because I kept imagining different audiences for your talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was imagining a Ukrainian audience, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm wondering is, so you are in part applying what you did so brilliantly in your first book when you were talking about people, especially in the Compton one elsewhere in the 80s, in this time that is now no more, and explaining how they situated themselves in the ideology. But now I'm wondering how you situate yourself anthropologically, ethically, when you're describing the stances of people. In a sense, there's a crime still going on,
Mm-hmm.
and these people are complicit in it in some way or another, perhaps, right? So how do you, and I agree with a lot of you saying, but how do you pitch this in a way that does not end up feeling exculpatory at a time when this is still happening.
Well, Elliot, did you, I don't know if you heard this bit.
Yeah.
I had a whole section about it. And of course, I have a bigger one. And I mean, it's extremely important to think about the ethical judgment here. As I was saying, none of what's going on can be possibly excused. I mean, because of everything is going on, none of the people who make these choices can be possibly excused, right? They are there not only to die, but to kill and to destroy. And that's very, very important, right? And that's exactly part of the sacrifice, because what makes Putin's system so specific is that it's not only, as I was saying, it's not only the object of sacrifice, this soldier, is also the tool of sacrifice, right? He's also sacrificing others, right? And that is different from from this classical model when someone is sacrificed to gods. At the same time, to understand the moral universe and to understand how these choices can be made, it's completely impossible to stay at the level of the personal responsibility, because then we don't have any explanation. We just we'll have an explanation, which we do here. They're just Russians. They're just what they do. And that's, sorry, I don't buy that. So I think in order for the ethical analysis to proceed, you need to understand how the state creates conditions, what I call political responsibility, right? As Hannah Arendt writes about it, creates conditions of precarity, conditions of propaganda, conditions of everything I listed there. I'm not going to list again, in the context of which then the certain choices, some people, not all, can made. So you have to analyze that whole assemblage, right, as an ethical assemblage. Another point for Ukrainian audience is that this analysis doesn't only concern Russia, it concerns also Putin's approach to Ukraine, right? As I was saying to you, this constant sacrificial logic, this destruction, this completely random firing of missiles at cities where people are killed in their apartments, right? Constantly, as we see. All of that is done with this logic of incorporation, of this civilizational incorporation, right? So therefore, this analysis expands to that. But of course, you were not asking me only a structural question, you were asking an ethical question, and that's what I answered first.
Hundreds of thousands of those conscripts, especially just soldiers, they come from the Russian prisons. You know, the first time in our history, you know, there are the whole bunch of penal colonies got closed.
And I have another one.
Yes.
No, I have another one.
Okay. Got closed because, you know, there are a lot of, that's the possibility for.
I spoke about it.
Yes, but you know, my question is, are they also driven by sacrifice?
Yes.
They are? All they want is just to
Wait.
from jail.
Who is driven by sacrifice? No one is driven by sacrifice. Come on, let's be logical here. They are driven by payments. They are driven by amnesty. They are driven by criminal acts deleted. They're driven by their credits destroyed. They're driven by being incorporated into the community, being respected, being loved by their loved ones. Many of these people P.S. Lab spoke with, their families hated them because of their crimes, and they want to prove to their kids that they're worth something, and so forth. That's what they're driven for. I'm saying that that driven is underlined by the sacrificial logic of the state. They are not thinking about sacrifice and not driven by it. So my point is that being decriminalized, your case thrown away, you are liberated, being paid a lot of money, being respected by your son, to whom you put an apartment, and many other things. They're all elements of the same precarity, which is used as a fuel for sacrifice.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Jane Burbank. I love this talk, very interesting, and it brought back a lot of experiences in the late Soviet period. some of the conditions you just described actually seem to me to work for the very late Soviet period, where there was indeed a kind of latent politics that the people
Absolutely.
didn't recognize.
That's what I wrote about in my book. That's why I was quoting myself.
Yeah, okay, and
Sorry about that.
yeah, and you know, I remember being a big demonstration in January 1991 in Moscow and seeing people surprised that other people were there.
Yeah,
They didn't know. Okay. So, but also from that period, I have very strong impression that a contradictory discourse, contradictory rhetoric was a form of power. And it was a way of making you feel humiliated under the control of whatever bureaucrat was telling you two different things that contradicted each other at the same time.
The naked lady and the icons.
Yeah,
Right.
that was a way of saying, this is power and take it.
Mhm.
So I have two questions. One is, to what extent, and now I'm not saying what Putin thinks about the Soviet Union, but I'm rather, to what extent do you see continuities in these kinds of sovereign practices from the Soviet period? That's the first question. And then the second one is, in my view, the Russian state came apart twice in the 20th century because the elite defected. 1917, the cadets and they were ready to bring down the state for their own goals. 1989, 91, again, we see a defection of the Soviet elites and the Soviet empire elites that brings it down. So I would like to hear you disaggregate a bit what you keep referring to as the state.
Yeah. So on the question of continuity, to what extent, as you said, these practices of atmospheric affective resonance, which I say is political, and which is reminiscent of the late Soviet period, and not only late perestroika, as you mentioned, but actually the 70s, when in my book I'm arguing that the unexpected implosion of the Soviet Union was made possible, not caused by, but made possible by the existence of this form of relationality and reproducing the system of rituals and speech acts, but actually withdrawing from the meanings of those things or reinterpreting them. Yeah. So the question of continuity. And I am not a historian, and therefore I'm very skeptical about the word continuity. Maybe some historians, cultural historians probably will be too. The thing is, we have a lot of different, a big archive of possibilities, many different tools in a toolbox. And one of them, you can go back to this habit of this form of knowledge which existed in late Soviet now. But it doesn't mean that somehow is continuously reproduced culturally. Everything in history is both continuity and rupture at the same time. It doesn't have to be reproduced. So this continuity is not at all preordained. It's there because yes, indeed, some people have the skill or they learned about it and they can be living in the conditions where they are seemingly go along, but actually creating community and creating this social, maybe with closest friends, some kind of social milieu, which then can resonate in moments like this Naoka ones, and they will be surprised. I also, on the other hand, don't necessarily find this so uniquely Russian. You find it like in all sorts of states, and the moments of rupture always retroactively can be explained by the presence of those things. As for the second question, which was...
You keep referring to the state.
The state.
Disaggregate it, please. Think about who are you talking about? I mean, you gave some examples of people producing the rhetoric that you described in certain ways.
Well, those people who I mentioned in the presidential administration, right, who reproduced this civilizational code discourse, like Khrushchev and Polosov and of course Putin and the whole Solovyov, the whole machinery of the media, which is very much centrally controlled from the Kremlin, from the administration under Kirienko. This whole apparatus which controls the information, but not only the information, also the tools which spread information, like internet, like media, like broadcasts, like frequencies on which things are broadcast, all of them. All of that is the state. So the system of the Ministry of Defense, which created this conscription, right, centers where people come and sign the payments, how, as I was talking about, that local governors are given these quotas from the center, which they have to fulfill. And if they don't, and they don't do it twice, they can be huge repercussions for them personally. So all of that is a system of the state. And also what happens on the front when this kind of black market economy of precarity where the officers extract money from the soldiers. And that's also the state. So it actually cascades down that sovereign system. Yeah. So all of that is the state.
Josh?
Yeah, I want to follow up on Carol's point from earlier, and push back on one thing about the analogy to Vietnam, because the war in Vietnam was fought by people who were drafted. And so what I wanted to ask you about was the implications of the war ending. So the war ends in Vietnam, and everybody who could have gotten drafted had it gone on for another year or two is ecstatic, right? Super happy. But you're describing a kind of system in equilibrium here where people are able to get this, join this civilization worth, but at the same time, gain tremendous material benefits from doing it for their families. We've had other speakers who've talked about the incentives of the wives and the children, you know, when the father signs up, and in particular the wives. So my question is, given that this has gone on for so long, given that this dynamic that you're talking about has developed, where the way people can talk about patriotism and get an 800,000 ruble bonus in the same breath, in the same advertisement, do you think people are going to miss this if the war ends? Do you think that this has become an embedded part, again, to Zhenya's question about this isn't in St. Petersburg, this isn't in Moscow where people can make a lot of money. This is in parts of the country where people don't have this.
Very few people can make a lot of money in Moscow and Petersburg.
Yeah,
Lots of people cannot.
Well, but
No,
these are very
not true.
poor part
Yeah.
persons.
Well, you know,
Do you think somehow that there is something where once the war is over
That's
and
not the
this
point.
option
Yeah.
no longer exists for these men to go off and get these very large sums of money for their family? And is this a potential form of instability
Right.
after the
Yeah.
war? And so do you think then that anticipating this, perhaps we'll still see these kinds of sign-up bonuses
Right.
even when they're not needed for the war? anymore?
Absolutely. So there are two questions here, and they are not really related. One is about Vietnam. I wasn't saying that the reason I brought up Vietnam was not to say that the people went to fight for a lot of money. I gave the example of the army today. I was saying that lots of people didn't quite understand the purpose. There was this big discourse in America that we don't quite know. So that was the parallel. As for the
But they got drafted. Right?
Of
Like-
course. So that is
Okay, so yeah,
different.
that's it.
So that was not the parallel.
Yeah.
Now and it's not even that important, right? Because we have a lot of other examples in America, so it doesn't have to be this one. But as for whether people will miss it, right? And as what you were saying, what will happen once it starts ending? I mean, first of all, we don't know. And second of all, of course, that's not a very interesting answer. And the more interesting answer is they will, of course, try to rearrange the system in such a way that there will be other forms of incentives, right? The system cannot, this sacrificial sovereignty cannot operate if you roll it down, if you roll it back, because then it will collapse. And I think it will be a real problem, not only because people will miss their payments, but because lots of people will come back, and then the questions will be asked, why? And lots of people not only will miss payments, but they will miss their relatives who are killed. And they will be also told by Ukrainians and by the world community, what have you done? Look at what you have, and so forth. That is what is a big, of course, danger for Putin. So sacrificial sovereignty, like all this kind of systems, authoritarian systems, can only operate by ratcheting it over and over and maybe reconstructing some of those incentives. How they will do it, I don't know. But I mean, I'm sure there are many different ways which they're thinking about. It's not going to be payment for a contract on the front, it will be payment for something else. But I think this is also inadvertently brings me to another point, which I wasn't mentioning in the talk because I don't like to predict what's going to happen, but it's also suggests that it's very unlikely that some kind of peace and end is going to happen anytime soon. That's unfortunately, I think, what your question points to, in which my analysis points to. I don't know for sure. I cannot put my signature under this, but I think that's very likely.
Yes, please.
This may be quite a bit off topic, but I've been thinking about this idea of sacrifice and how our very individualistic, self-centered American culture could use a little more sacrifice. And that there's something to be said for a society that values some kind of grand sacrifice, some kind of cultural sacrifice, as screwed up as that may be.
But you know, there are sacrifices and sacrifices. Sacrifice in the Second World War, or in the Great Patriotic War, was for the liberation of the country, of the land, of the people from the invasion. That's what Ukrainian sacrifice is for. The sacrifice in Putin's system is not for that. This is why it is disconnected from the clearly defined reason for which you can die. You die for all sorts of other things. So this is a sacrifice which is not very, not what you would want America to have more of.
One more question from me. You know, we are of the same age.
There's also a guy there in the
Yes,
back.
I will return back. Yeah. We're about the same age. We grew up when the anti-war rhetoric was both coming from top, from people who were in charge of the Soviet Union and who went through all this awfulness of the World War II, and both from the bottom. All of us, you know, we kept repeating this "Только бы не было войны." If only there were no war. The famous Евтушенko's poem «Хотят ли русские войны? Спросите вы у тишины, спросите вы у тех солдат, кто под березами лежат». It was, you know, I grew up in the family where both mom and dad, they fought at the front lines. And so one thing that is really, I really don't understand. How was it possible? How did Putin succeed in turning the psyche of the people in each and every Russian family? There was somebody who died during the Great Patriotic War. How did he manage to turn this notion, только бы не было войны, only no war, into this, you know, let's make some money by killing Ukrainians?
Well, he neither turned the psyche of anyone, nor did he say, let's kill some Ukrainians for money. Those things don't exist in Russia. I was talking about a structural argument here. The war is experienced not as murder. It's not experienced as I'm going to be a killer and you better pay me for this. It's not experienced in those terms. It's experienced as providing for the family. It's experienced for regaining honor. It's experienced as finally making something of my life.
And raping women in Bucha and
yes,
and stealing stuff
and that's
from
how
houses in Ukraine.
And that's how armies work once they are in the army process. Those things emerge. You don't first turn people into this robots who want to go and rape and then send them to do it. Once they are in the front, that's what
I saw the first and the second war in Chechnya.
Yes.
Nothing like, you know, it was exclusive cases.
Well, in Chechnya, they completely destroyed the whole city of Grozny.
Yes, of course, but I'm just saying that, you say that, this rape and, and killing civilians and stolen goods, it
Yeah.
came with every war. I'm telling you, I was there.
No,
We
but
were afraid of
we're talking-
Russian soldiers
we're
because
talking-
we were raped on these blog posts. But
I agree with you about the horrors. I'm answering your question. How did Putin manage to turn the psyche of the people? He didn't. That's what I'm saying. What he did was he created structural conditions within which this becomes normalized. That's how states operate, and that's how a lot of these crimes are possible. Crimes of colonialism were not created by people who are first made into this racists in some institute in London and then sent to India to kill everyone. No. So I'm just answering as an
last
anthropologist
question.
again.
there was somebody there. Yes, please. I don't see you. Yes, please.
Finally, my turn.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you. I'm so sorry.
There are several of them there.
I think I'm sitting here at NYU. Thank you for your talk. My question was linked to another question because while answering another question, you said that the ultimate goal of this war for the regime, for the state, is to create a society, create a subject who would reproduce this kind of autocratic rule.
Yeah.
Respectively for eternity or something, as they say. How do you think is as if we observe that this form of sovereignty comes and emerges after the war and as a direct consequence of the war. If we are to speak counterfactually, do you think that in case of peacetime, in case of return to any form of peacetime, even with the same autocratic rule, even with Putin in power, do you think that this form of sovereignty, this modus operandi of the state will change?
Yeah.
Or this kind of sovereignty is the exact ultimate goal which we want to maintain and to preserve despite the potential peace?
As I was arguing, the state is not successful. In my opinion, it's not successful. It's successful in continuing this machinery, but it's not successful in creating this identification with this civilizational project. And I was giving examples of this spontaneous atmospheres as a little symptoms of that. But many, many other things which I was talking about, including how the people who sign contracts don't necessarily want to repeat the official patriotic slogan. They just say, I think it's an unjust war, but I still sign. There are many other. So all of those are symptoms of the fact that it's not the kind of system which Putin claims it is, right? So in my opinion, when something starts changing at the top, right, either they will, as you were saying, bring in troops back, or Putin is gone. It's very likely, I don't want to predict just like you, but I think it's very likely, based on my knowledge of what happened in late Soviet period, that the system will implode, because it's definitely based on a very different kind of foundation and the potentiality of what people can do, as opposed to what they say they do, as I was saying, quoting Nigel Thrift, that this potentiality is definitely there. And I see it in many, many examples, which is why I think this whole polling, which produces this horrible figure of support, which of course plays in Putin's hands. He then says, look at the figures, not he, but his propagandists, figures of support. Even New York Times says how many, sorry, second time, the percentage of support. And then more people in Russia feel like saying that they support because everyone else supports, so I have to, and so forth. So it's actually, those polls are very counterproductive. First of all, they don't measure anything clear. We don't know what they measure. And second of all, they're very, very problematic. But going back to your question, I think, like you, that it's very likely that it's not going to be sustainable, I think. But I don't want to, again, you to cite me later, because I don't know. No one knows.